Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today. We're just going to give it a couple minutes for folks to make their way into the room. So welcome and come on in. If you're just joining us, come on in. We're just giving it a couple more minutes for folks to make their way in, and then we'll kick off here shortly. All right. While folks make their way in, I'll go ahead and kick us off just with a brief introduction. So again, hello and welcome. We're really glad to have you all here today. I'm Amanda Stoller from the Center for Open Science, and I'm really happy to introduce this session, this webinar today, Global Lessons, Local Context, Regional Perspectives on Open Science Education. So today's session will really explore how open science education is evolving across Europe, Canada, and the United States, and looking at how local policies, institutional priorities, and researcher needs influence this implementation. So we're really thrilled to have a great panel here today. I want to introduce our speakers, starting with Michael de Boer, who is an associate professor in epidemiology at the University Medical Center Groningen, and who is also representing the Network for Education and Research Quality, known as NERC, which you'll hear more about in just a few minutes here. We also have Kelly Kobe, the Director of Metascience and Open Science Program at the University of Ottawa Heart Institute, and Associate Professor in the School of Epidemiology and Public Health at the University of Ottawa. And rounding us out, we have Crystal Steltenpol, who is our Training and Education Manager here at the Center for Open Science. So we're thrilled to have this panel together today. And if you have any questions during today's session, please put them in the Q&A you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar. So we'll keep an eye on that. And as we close out the presentations from the speakers, we'll have a bit of a Q&A and some conversation. So feel free to drop questions in there periodically as the session goes on through the hour or so. And with that, I will stop my screen share and hand it over to Mikhail to get us started.
Thank you, Amanda. Glad to be here. Thanks for the invite. Let me see if I can actually share my screen. I hope this works. Yeah, can you see that, Amanda?
Yep, you're good to go.
Great. Okay, so as Amanda said, I'm gonna tell you about NERC, which is a network that aims to foster high-quality training on responsible conduct of research in Europe, which I'm part of. I made this presentation together with Julia Pries-Boegheid, one of the founders, together with Mariette van den Hove. And I'll tell you a little bit about the network, but before that, we're always obliged to show this slide when we talk about NERC. So I also had to do that today because we like the network very much. NERC was founded in 2022 as a peer-led network, and with an online launch, and actually it attracted already then more than 90 participants. And in 2023, there was a hybrid meeting in Brussels where 11 what we call special interest groups formed. And special interest groups are groups that work on focus areas within education for research quality. And it's good to, I think, acknowledge that these special interest groups also evolve over time. So we started with 11, then a couple of them are still active now. There have been new ones that emerged, and that all depends a little bit on, yeah, the need for specific areas to work on, and also the capacity within the network to work on these things. Now, these special interest groups have to align with the aims of the network, and the aims are that we would like to exchange good practices, experiences, and formats, stimulate the quality of training and trainers, and encourage collaboration on research-based education. So all the things we do within a network should be under one or more of these aims. Now, a couple of key actions with respect to open science within the network. We have train-the-trainer programs. We've done one in which I was involved in Brussels, which I will tell a little bit more about. There's one, I think, planned for Lisbon. So that's coming, and I'm pretty sure we'll do more in the future. There's a position paper on open science and responsible conduct of research education. And there's an initiative called the GATE initiative. It's a platform for open science capacity building, which I will also tell you a little bit more about in a bit. Now, we also organize collaborative events like the Train the Trainer event in Brussels, and also training events in collaboration with the Anna Lindh Foundation. Talking about community involvement and innovation in open science education, there's a couple of active special interest groups that relate to that. So there's the Open Science Interest Group again. I'll tell you more about. There's a group that I co-lead. That's the group on research methodology education. I will also tell you a little bit more about that in a bit. Then there's a group on peer coaching that was recently installed. So that's, I think, yeah, goes without saying, a sort of a community initiative. And also a new special interest group is on intellectual property and open science. In our so our dissemination and our communication is done via LinkedIn, and NERC has 380 members at the moment, or more than 380 members. And as a network, we're also active at different conferences. So we were active at the World Conference of Research Integrity in Athens, and we will be also in Vancouver in 2026. Actually, at the moment, people from NERC are active at the ENI conference. That's the European Network of Academic Integrity. And we will also be present at the MetaScience 2025 conference. We collaborate with, as I said already, the Anna Lindh Foundation, but also networks of academic integrity with the Netherlands Research Integrity Network, with the European Commission, and now also with the Center for Open Science, of course, and also with several reproducibility networks. And many of us are also part of these reproducibility networks. So that's also, I think, very integrated within the work that we do. So a couple of examples of special interest groups that work on advancing open science. So of course, our special interest group on open science, and again, I will tell you a little bit more about the GATE initiative. They were also present with a poster on the World Conference on Research Integrity, trainer sessions, etc. My own SIG, which I will tell you a little bit about. in the special interest group on IP, so intellectual property and open science, which is set up yes, under the umbrella of a European project that is being done now, and that will develop training on synergizing intellectual property with open science. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting area to explore. And then also, I think a very timely topic is a new SIG that was recently developed for on research security. Um, so yeah, I'm also very much looking forward to the work there. Um, I'm gonna discuss a couple of the initiatives a bit more in detail, starting with the Open Science Learning Gate I talked about. So this is a picture from the website there, and the Learning Gate, yeah, targets what they call knowledge creators. So that can be trainers or educators, these people who share knowledge about open science practices. Um, and what they do in the gate is they ask the knowledge creators to fill out a questionnaire, and asking them specifically on the guiding thoughts and principles when they developed their materials. And the idea is then to feed those guiding thoughts or principles back to the community, and in that way, creating sort of a living corpus of open science training and dissemination principles, along with the materials that these were based on. And they also give tips to people to share their materials openly. And so this has just, I think, been started about 6 months ago, and they provide yearly reports back. So yeah, we have to wait, of course, until we get the first report back. But I think this will be a very nice yeah, tool for us, for the open science community. And everybody here who wants to participate in that is of course very welcome. Okay, so the other thing I want to yeah, or tell about now is also our responsible conduct of research training. It's specifically a train the trainer session that we did in Brussels, where we I think really had the philosophy to yeah, talk about responsible research, sorry, conduct of research, and use that as an umbrella term to connect things like open science, including reproducibility, research integrity, research ethics, and also emphasizing that these aspects of responsible conduct of research can be approached from an integrated way. And so that was, I think, very core to what we did there. Also, we tried to use, or we did use, case studies to showcase and practice different didactical, mostly active learning approaches. For instance, role playing in learning about and reflecting on proper data management. And the event was on site and also pretty intense, but that worked out, I think, or also pretty well, because people were really outside of their normal work and really inside this responsible conduct of training bubble, and I think that was really good. Well, we had participants from a large variety of countries and backgrounds, which was very nice. And some observations that we did was the capacity of trainers in varying countries in Europe is really varied across Europe. And also correlated to that is the fact that for some of the people that were there, support from higher management was really difficult to get. So we actually did a couple of coaching sessions on these kinds of things as well. Okay, so last thing I want to talk about is stuff that I was also involved in within my own special interest group. We did a survey in Europe to examine practices and attitudes regarding teaching research methodology in different countries across different disciplines and also different training stages. Used a stratified and snowball sampling, a form of sampling. So we try to sample different countries, but also specifically different disciplines, and from there on try to snowball that. And we included both teachers of higher education. We included teachers of higher education, but both those teaching research methods, but also teaching other subjects. And I just want to show you one result that relates to open science as well. So we asked all participants to rate potential topics in research methods education according to how necessary they thought these were to include within their teachings or within teaching research methods. And one thing that struck us was that things related to open science, like data management plans or pre-registration, were rated the least important. So we think there's still some work that can be done there, maybe a more integrated approach there, integrating these open science aspects within research methods education. But we think that might be better, and I think there's work there. Okay, so a couple of conclusions from the work we've done within the network. So context matters for responsible conduct of research trainings. We especially saw that capacity and support for RCR training varies widely across Europe. So and also I think a lot of work there has to be done. There seem to be some opportunities for more integrated approaches in RCR training. What we saw in our study in the cross-sectional survey we did. And maybe a bit to our surprise, our network has actually been quite successful, despite we also have challenges like hardly any funding. We have to do with people that do that in the time they have, etc. But it's been a lot of fun, I think, for a lot of people involved in NERC, and that makes, I think, that we also done quite some work and are looking forward to do more. Okay, that's it for me. I'll stop sharing, and then I think I will hand the mic, the virtual mic.
All right. Thank you so much, Michiel. Thanks everyone for the opportunity to speak today and for your time. I'm going to be speaking about regional perspectives on open science education within the Canadian context. So in terms of my aims, I want to start by providing a bit of an overview of the Canadian open science landscape. And then I'm going to give some examples illustrating some of my own meta research in the Canadian open science landscape to basically show that we've got strong science policy mandates, but there's a gap when it comes to implementation. And then I'm going to end off by discussing perspectives on how we can move from talk to walk. So, actually implementing these science policy goals and documents that we've created nationally. So to start off with a bit of background information. So, open science, this movement to make research more transparent and the set of practices that will do that is becoming quite mainstream globally, but certainly in Canada as well. Many of you will be familiar with pan-national recommendations for open science, such as the UNESCO recommendations, but I wanted to provide some Canadian-specific context. So within Canada, we had a directive from our government on openness, and part of that resulted in a roadmap for open science that was released in February 2020 by Dr. Mona Niemer's office, who's our Chief Scientific Officer. And so Dr. Mona Niemer's office created this roadmap for open science, and it largely applied to federal agencies, so it did not apply to universities. But one of the things it did is it meant that our federal agencies and departments, such as Health Canada, who you see here, they had to respond to the roadmap by creating their own open science action plans that would specify how they were going to go about implementing the recommendations of the roadmap. So these documents now exist, and there's efforts on the ground to implement the recommendations of the roadmap. At a more institutional level, I would say that we probably could have a more integrated approach in terms of how open science is implemented, say, in universities and research institutions. It can vary quite a lot, and I don't think there's a lot of crosstalk, but we do have a couple of sort of standout institutions, including the Montreal Neurological Institute, which several years ago completely reprincipled their strategic goals around open science and made a commitment to it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through a couple of examples of open science policies that we have in Canada and talk a little bit about our lack of compliance to them and some things I think that we can do through training and education to drive improvements. So the first example is open access publishing, so making research freely available to access and build upon. Within Canada right now, at the federal level, our tri-agencies, which are our three federal funders of research, they actually have an open access mandate that permits a 12-month embargo period. So we can publish any way we wish, but within 12 months, a openly available version of that work needs to be made available. So that can be through a variety of different formats, including archiving the postprint. However, right now in Canada, there's active discussion and consultation on that policy, and they're potentially looking at aligning with other jurisdictions such as Europe and States and having this sort of immediate open access requirement. So I suspect that's the case, that consultation is very active right now. But I wanted to highlight as well, within the Canadian context, something important to keep in mind is that although we have federal funders of research, we also have quite powerful provincial funders of research. And education actually sits within the jurisdiction of the province. So, for example, in Quebec, which you see highlighted here in blue, the Fonds de Research de Quebec have signed Plan S, so the provincial funder there. And so in that province, when you're funded through them, immediate OA is required. So all in all, the policies are looking fine, and we're looking to sort of strengthen at the federal level. But when we asked how we're actually doing at implementing these policies, work of colleagues in Quebec led by Vincent Lariviere has shown that when we look across provinces and territories, our implementation of open access publishing is really suboptimal. So, we're well under 50% in the vast majority of provinces. The top here, a couple territories with very low N, make it a little bit higher, but we see this gap between what we intend to do and what we're actually doing. And this gap, I think, is really important to address. There is a moral imperative for open access to scientific information. So I've done some work trying to do, I guess, science advocacy and education around the power of open access information to patients, particularly in the biomedical space. And so you can read more. I'll share my slides about the story of a patient here in Ottawa called Jenna Kendall, who basically, through accessing an open access article, had her diagnosis changed. So she was diagnosed with limb-girdle muscular dystrophy, but actually through her reading of the literature, it became clear to her that she actually had an autoimmune disorder. And so this completely changed the course of her life. She now has treatments available to her that she otherwise did not. And I think her story really highlights this sort of moral imperative. And as the Declaration of Human Rights from the UN states, everyone does have the right to freely participate in the cultural life of the community, to enjoy the arts, and to share in the scientific advancement and its benefits. So as a nation in Canada and elsewhere, I think we need to do more to make sure that we're upholding this. The second practice pertaining to open science nationally that I'll mention is study registration. So, in the social sciences, social psychology in particular, folks refer to this as pre-registration, but in medicine, study registration has a long history for decades as it relates to clinical trials. So the tri-agencies in Canada, like many other nations, have signed a WHO declaration, which requires that when you're conducting particular types of trials, that they be prospectively registered in a publicly available registry before you start recruitment. And then once you're done your study, you have to put the summary results within the registry within 12 months. And so there's very, I think, critically important reasons for why this mandate exists. It can help prevent publication bias and selective outcome reporting. So by starting off with a record of what you're going to do in the registry, we can actually track forward to make sure that, if you say your primary outcome is A and your secondary outcome is B, when we see the results, we're seeing results on both A and B. So we're not missing anything, and there's not whole publication bias occurring either. It also is really important in medicine to create a public record of ongoing trials. So this is literally something clinicians and patients can use to directly identify trials to participate in, but also for completed results. So to know sort of up to the minute current results is really critical in this way. The registry also provides the data in a very standardized format, which is different than what we see in publications. So we've had this mandate for some time. We've actually strengthened this mandate by signing further declarations and commitments within Canada. But our team looked at, how we're actually doing when it comes to trial registration. And we did this by looking at all trials registered on clinicaltrials.gov between 2009 and 2019. And we looked firstly at what % of trials were registered prospectively. So this is really critical to actually mitigate the selective outcome reporting. And we find, despite the quite strict mandate from our country, just 56% of trials are registered prospectively. Even worse, when we look at how many go back when they're done the trial and put the results in, we see it's just 39%. And this is problematic for the reasons I've just said, but also because often, even when people publish, the results are not openly available, right? So it may be behind a paywall. So having the standard and publicly available version of the results is really critical. We did look at what % of clinical trials go on to be published in a scholarly journal. This is not a mandate, but we were thinking, okay, perhaps if people are not using the registry, they're reporting in another way. And we find just 55% of trials registered in this database go on to have an associated publication. So there's an enormous amount of whole publication bias occurring. And then when you put it all together, who registered their study prospectively, then reported the results in a timely fashion, and then published in a scholarly journal. These feel like very basic things to do with a research project. We find that just 3% of researchers in our country performed all three of these practices on time. Okay, so the last practice that I'll mention is open science as it pertains to data management and sharing. And so this is a really, I would say, hot topic in Canada right now. We have a fairly recent policy from our tri-agencies on data management that came out in 2021, but it's being phased in. So there's a set of different requirements, which I'll go through in a minute. But the overall objective of this policy is really to support Canadian researchers in their research data management and the data stewardship practices. So really formalizing research data management at the researcher and research institution level. And to do that, we have basically three things that we've been told we need to do. So the first thing is, starting in 2022, many of our grant calls have required data management plans at the time of grant submission. So not just if you're funded, it's part of the adjudication process. So this has been a big change. Most people haven't been writing formal data management plans, much less adjudicating them. So that's been a big educational gap for our community. The second thing is that research institutions wanting to receive federal funding from the tri-agencies, they were obligated to create institutional research data management strategies. So again, really formalizing how institutions think about their data and manage it. And I can say, as someone who sat on a number of institutions' committees to develop these strategies, this was really big in terms of getting this sort of institutional buy-in to start thinking and supporting researchers in data management. And then finally, The last aspect of this policy that's yet to be phased in, but we expect it soon, is they have a goal to implement a requirement for data deposits. So this is not an open data requirement, so you don't have to share openly. I think ideally you would, but they recognize that in certain instances that won't be possible, but we nonetheless need to see there's a deposit somewhere. So our team actually looked at the institutional strategies produced in response to this new mandate. And what we found was that the overwhelming majority of institutions in our country indicated that their top need to respond to the research data management policy was to develop RDM expertise among research community and staff. And so this is their main priority. And so this is something, sort of a pattern in the type of research that our team does, is we sort of do a cross section of how the policy is being implemented. We identify gaps, and then we try to create educational resources to fill those. So our team has been working pretty actively on creating things like data management plan templates, consent templates that permit downstream sharing, and other resources broadly related to supporting this new research data management policy. And so you can check those out there or read about this particular study that's a preprint on OSF. When we looked at these institutional strategies, very basic gaps come out. So we have a tool, a federal tool, it's bilingual, called the DMP Assistant, to help researchers make DMPs. And less than half of institutional strategies were aware or at least mentioned this tool. We also now have information that indicates from these strategies that when we compare universities to colleges and cégeps, so cégeps are kind of college-like structures in Quebec, basically universities plan on creating content, and colleges and cégeps plan on pointing to content around research data management. So in terms of gaps, what we're seeing is that colleges and cégeps are relying on universities to produce the materials that will support data management planning, and they will sort of point to them. When we look at institutional support for data deposit, we have two federal infrastructures, Borealis and Further, that could be used for data deposit. You can see the vast majority of institutional strategies are either unaware or not mentioning these in their strategy. We've got 14% of institutions planning to create their own repository, which suggests some unnecessary duplication probably, and a lot that just don't even have anything around data deposit. They're not clear on how to fulfill this mandate. So I think what this suggests is sort of gaps in resourcing, gaps in the appropriateness of infrastructure, and a real need for education and training in this space for us not to suffer from another sort of policy to implementation gap like we've seen with the previous policies I mentioned. And the last slide on this study, we also looked in the Canadian context, there's a real salient consideration of Indigenous data sovereignty. And so looking at whether institutions are aware of this consideration and how significantly their strategy addressed Indigenous data considerations, we find that just 39% of strategies did. So this would be a major gap in the national context, ensuring that there is sufficient consultation and engagement with Indigenous communities at each institution in this country. Okay, so to sort of sum up and conclude, I don't want the take-home message of the talk to be that Canada's created policies it doesn't implement. Certainly, we have data suggesting that this is the case for several of our open science practices. But I feel like I've been back in Canada for almost 10 years since my time in Europe, and I'm seeing like enormously changing tides even in the last two years. So to illustrate some of the things that are happening really proactively that support open science implementation, open science education, and incentivization, I have a few examples here. So we had this year our first call ever in the country specific to meta-research. So our agencies joined Rory, and as part of that initiative, launched our first funding call for researchers to apply for meta-research specific projects. As someone who directs a program on open science and meta-research, I can state with confidence it's very challenging to find funding in our Canadian landscape for this. So this was a major and welcome change for those of us working in this space. There's also awards from certain institutes within the health funder, the CIHR. So the Institute of Musculoskeletal Health and Arthritis has specific excellence prizes that are cash to spend on research that's already been done. So it's recognizing research you've already done. And they've had these for the past 3 years. And this year, for the first time ever in Canada, we are hosting our first national conference in open science. So you can check out the QR code. That will be in October in Montreal. So we can see a lot of momentum and concrete actions happening, which was very different than just a few years ago. Finally, I wanted to highlight that along with colleagues, including David Mower, who I think is on the call, I'm co-leading Canadians, the Reproducibility Network. And so we're trying to create a network of researchers. One of our sort of subtopic areas in this is open science, and really creating a community of practice for people to connect in our country and address barriers and prompt facilitators for open science implementation. We're also at this time conducting a national survey of Canadian researchers about barriers and facilitators to research reproducibility, which intersects certainly with open science. And a lot of this will talk about sort of the educational training needs that they need. And this builds on a prior study our team did looking at that same sort of general concept of barriers and facilitators to reproducibility, but we did it in a global scale in the biomedical research community. And so finally, the thing that I think is going to really help this momentum around open science within Canada is that there's fairly concerted action, certainly among funders, to make fairly significant changes to our research assessment practices. So all of our major federal funding agencies have now signed DORA, the Declaration on Research Assessment, which as an organization I'm involved in as co-chair, and several other funders. We've got 6 to 8 organizational institutional signatories in Canada. And it's not just that these institutions have signed, there's concrete actions that have started to take place in the past couple of years. So we've gone from recognition of a problem in how we value quantity over quality to actually, new research excellence frameworks to illustrate pathways to impact, as well as a recent announcement that we'll be shifting towards a narrative CV template, which will allow a more nuanced reflection of, not just what you did, but how you did it and the quality and rigor of your research approach. So I'll stop there and just to thank my funders and institution for their support. Much of this research is actually funded by my institution. And so we're really excited that there are now new streams nationally to support this type of work.
All right, thanks. And then I'm going to round us off today and talk a bit about training as culture change, and speak to my experiences working here at the Center for Open Science as the training and education manager, and some of the things that we've run across as an organization that provides training for researchers from a variety of backgrounds, whether that's geographic, whether that's in terms of their field, in terms of their methodology. And so my goal basically has been to help to expand our training to cover more of the research life cycle. When I came here in 2023, we had 4 modules for training. We had, how to use the OSF, which makes sense because we have the Open Science Framework. Also data management and sharing, reproducibility, and research material sharing. And the impression that I was getting as we were getting these training requests that were coming in is that they were largely coming in from groups who already knew what open science was, that they were already really excited for it, and they really wanted to dig into the how. Like, how do I do this? How do I manage and share my data? How do I use the OSF, right? How do I share my materials? How do I make sure that my work is reproducible so that other people can use it? And kind of as time has gone on and more organizations and communities and institutions and governments are talking about open science and implementing policies to require people to, say, share their data, we've gotten more and more requests from people who kind of actually needed us to take a little bit of a step back. And so over the last several years, we've worked to create a couple of additional modules that have really enabled us to kind of highlight more of the entire research life cycle and the different kinds of decisions that people are making throughout that research life cycle, to be able to engage in open science more thoroughly. And so by now we've also added, a module on an introduction to open scholarship, pre-registration and registered reports, preprints, and then actually really interestingly, perhaps to this group, teaching about open scholarship. So one of the things that we also noticed over time was that it wasn't just researchers coming to us saying, I want to do this in my own work, but it was also, librarians or faculty who were teaching students, or people who had a community of practice that they either wanted to develop or that already existed. And they were like, it's not even necessarily important that I do it in my own work. Maybe I'm not a researcher, but I'm supporting other people in their research role, but I don't know how to teach them how to engage in these activities. And so we've had some interest in that. And the way that our training modules work is that they're usually somewhere between an hour and 2 hours per module. People kind of select the ones that they are interested in using, and then we schedule them according to whatever the audience needs. So sometimes people will also come to us and say, hey, I just have an hour. It's going to be like a lunch and learn. People want to know what pre-registration is. Can you do that? And then other times they might say something like, we're having all of this new cohort of graduate students or this new cohort of fundees coming in. And we want them to really sit down and dig into data management and sharing. And this is probably going to be a pretty talkative group. We want to have plenty of time for discussion. And so then we might extend that, a little bit closer to 2 hours. And so there's really a lot of variability in terms of what our audience needs. And so we've really tried to make sure that our materials are also reflecting that, so that people can kind of pick and choose what they need. We've also started to, and I think this is in line with some of the stuff that Michelle and Kelly were talking about, really playing with the modality of the training. Of course, we've got potentially this train the trainer module where we're teaching people how to teach in addition to the open science aspects. And then also looking at the future exploration of asynchronous options. Kind of as Kelly was talking about in her presentation, training's not just lecturing, right? So somebody that's trying to train a community might create walkthroughs or guides or checklists or templates, right? Especially for data management and sharing. And so all of these are also training, and also useful for helping people to develop the skills to be able to engage in open science practices. We also revamped our evaluations a bit more to be a bit more thorough, to be a bit more consistent, and help to link our learners with their actual scholarly activity later. One of the things about training is that it usually has an impact on attitudes and perspectives about a topic immediately, but it's not going to have an immediate impact on behavior if you're measuring like right before the training and right after the training. They haven't had a chance to actually do the thing that you're trying to teach them about. That takes a lot longer to measure. And so we're really working on trying to understand the role that training has in behavior over time. And then also importantly for us is that we'd like to share our training insights with other teams. And so we're building out ways to do that over time. But because I train people from across the world, from a wide range of folks in different fields, I wanted to share a couple of the things that I've learned since I've been here that might be helpful for anybody that's considering training in their own organization. And I think this actually echoes a lot of the stuff that we've heard today. The first is that training is actually not just technical skill building. Again, early on, I think a lot of people who were coming to us for training they knew what open scholarship was, they wanted to do it, they really wanted to dig into the how. But as it becomes more required to engage in these activities, I think that you're going to see like a wider range of people who maybe don't know what open science is or don't see the point, or who may even have some like negative opinions of it based on previous interactions or things that they've heard. And so it really is about culture change in terms of thinking about how people perceive these activities. Do they see them as useful? Do they see them as required? I was really interested in Michelle's presentation where you mentioned that, people didn't necessarily think that data management, sharing, and pre-registration were particularly important. Like that is something that training can help people see, like the utility of different practices in different contexts. So it is really important to not just think about how do I get people to engage in step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, but also to see the importance of it, to see the value of it. And to really like hone in on that and make sure that people can understand why they're doing what they're doing. I talk about this a lot in my Train the Trainer um, modules that I give, that sometimes people like to rely on compliance. Like, you're being told to do this, so you should do this is important because you're being told to do this. And I find that that tends to people, their eyes glaze over and they start to say, well, I don't really care then. Getting them to care about it beyond it, connecting it to their values, connecting it to the things that they already want to be doing or the things that they already struggle with that these practices can help with, tend to be a little bit better of an approach. Also, as we've kind of heard today as well, that institutions and scholars have varying needs. Whenever I am first setting up a training with an organization, I like to try to figure out like who might attend the training. It's going to be different if it's graduate students and faculty from a single department, than if it's going to be, librarians or research support staff. And it's going to be different depending on, what country the organization is in, or there may be actual institutional policies as well, like for a university or for a nonprofit or for a funder. And so really having that conversation about where people are at, and what the culture of the organization that you're presenting to already has, can be really, really beneficial to making sure that the training is like most useful for that organization. And then also here at the Center for Open Science, we like to emphasize reusable, adaptable materials for diverse contexts. So even though our trainings are paid and people come and they're basically paying for me to be the person to present and to provide examples and to provide follow-up support, we also have our materials available openly and they're easily adaptable for different contexts. And we also point people to other organizations that have open access materials like the Framework for Open and Reproducible Training. But it's FORT, FORRT, and research and training. That's what it is. Framework for Open and Reproducible Research and Training. And so we like to share and to kind of spread the wealth in terms of where people are getting their materials, because it is so variable depending on your field, depending on the methods you use, depending on the country that you're in or the state that you're in. You have these different contexts that inform the way that your research is done. And so we try to help people know that there are actually a lot of materials out there that can be really useful for folks, and that they come in different ways, that you're not just lecturing. And then I think lastly, the last thing I'd like to share before we move to Q&A is that I think it's also really important to share insights from training implementation. Kelly mentioned that like 3% of people are sharing out those 3 things with their pre-registrations. That number can only go up, I think, with a combined collaboration between training and policy and institutional support. And so that data needs to be shared also within those groups and those stakeholders to help inform. Having a policy but not teaching anybody how to do it, obviously people aren't going to be able to meet the policy. At the same time, if people are taught to do something but they're not taught the value of it, then that also makes it hard for people to implement these things. And then also, even if people know how to do it, and even if it's required, if they don't have the support from their institution to actually be able to engage in these practices, that also makes it really, really challenging for people to be able to actually implement the behavior that we'd like them to do. So it really does take a collaboration between policy, training, and institutional support to be able to encourage people to engage in open scholarship practices. And so with that, I will pass it back to you, Amanda.
Awesome. Thank you, Crystal. Thank you, everyone, for those presentations. Really great. If you are here and you have questions, please drop them in the Q&A and we'll take a look at those and revisit some that may have come up already. But I can kick us off with just a question that I think all of you spoke to in some degree through your presentations, but really just coming back to the, sort of where do you see the most critical barriers around open science adoption and education. So really, Kelly, kind of going back to the, how do we go from the talk to the action? What are those critical places? And maybe alongside that, do you see any sort of exciting momentum in any spaces that are addressing, overcoming those barriers? So I'll open that up to the group and anybody who wants to take a shot at it.
You can kick us off. It's a great question. I think it's sort of like the $1 million question, right? Like how do we do this? I think for me, my own sort of career path, I became interested in open science, and it just seemed like an intuitive way research should be done. There shouldn't be open science, there should just be science, and it should be open by default. But I always get pulled away from meta research on open science and open science implementation, and pulled towards the responsible research assessment sort of movement. So I think we have these sort of two parallel change movements, but there's deep intersections between them. I think there's a quote by a late statistician, Doug Altman from Oxford, that says we need less research, we need better research, and we need research done for the right reasons. And I think, it was decades ago that comment was made, and it's still true. I think right now, as an early career, geriatric, but early career researcher, I think the reality is, like, at the end of the day, people just care how much I publish, where I publish. I as co-chair of DORA, I still have these same constraints as every other researcher does in many jurisdictions. And I think until a time comes where we're going to incentivize and reward and allow time and space for researchers to upskill themselves in open science methods and research rigor approaches, and to just take time to do less but do it better, we won't have open science. That we need the incentives and acknowledgement that to do this good science takes more time, and so bean counting publications isn't going to get us what we want.
Yeah, I would agree with Kelly. I actually was in a meeting at my own university today talking about open science practices and yeah, the gaps that we have. So what we see, and I think that is across the Netherlands, is that policies are usually in place, and I think that that's also what Kelly spoke about. So, but we still see a gap between widespread adoption of these policies and the policies themselves. And yeah, one of the things I think that we see is that what we call pockets of excellence. So there's these groups within universities or departments that work very openly and or reproducible, or yes, and stuff like that. And then outside of these groups, sometimes people do not know, are not aware, or maybe partly work openly. And so I agree with Kelly that one of the things is that we need to recognize and reward open work, and I think we need to have people or get people allocated time to work openly, because especially at first that takes more time working as people have always done. But it's also, I think, what we also discussed is that we need forces from top down and from bottom up. And so these people who are in these pockets of excellence need to talk to their peers, and we need community-driven approaches, but also support from the top and sideways support. I think that's really important to encourage that and relate that.
Yeah, and I think to add to those excellent points, I think also just a shift of what it means to be a scientist or to be a researcher. So I think, you always hear this like myth of like the sole scientist who does the entire study themselves, and I think we just can't do that anymore, right? I think I think especially if we're asking people to make a DMP and then to design the study and then to collect the data. I mean, first off, I don't think that science was ever just one person running an entire study. I think maybe only one person got credit for it. But like, you know, you've got to collect the data, you've got to clean the data, you've got to manage the data, you've got to share the data, you've got, you know, there's all these different things that we're asking for researchers to do, and they cannot do that by themselves. Like you cannot have one, it would take, you know, a decade for a single study if you want to like really make sure that there's proper metadata and the proper access and everything else. And so I think like one thing that institutions can do that could, you know, help to reduce barriers to provide that additional research support. So I know that there are some institutions, for instance, that have started to hire, I don't know the exact term, but it's you can kind of think of it as like a reproducibility officer or something. So it's like somebody that I'm getting ready to submit my paper for publication. I'm going to give it to I'm going to hand it over to this person who's going to, you know, run a reproducibility check and draft up a short report that says, here's what I was able to do, here's how this works. And then that helps that researcher to have that check, right? So it's not somebody on their team that has to go through everything and find everything, that's somebody else that does it. And that also mirrors what you're going to see out in the real world after the paper is published, that somebody who's not familiar with the study is going to come in and try to reproduce all of that. Having these additional supports, like with data management plans, where there are templates and there are also systems that are set up that you can send your DMP draft to the library, and then that gets some feedback on that from an outside person. I think like those kinds of things can really help to provide less friction for people to engage in these practices, because they don't have to be an expert on every single open science practice, every single research practice. They can really collaborate across an institution to put that into play. I think that's something that is currently a roadblock for a lot of people, is that there's just so much that's being asked of each individual person.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah. And continuing on that, a question from the audience from Inez, just looking at some of those implementation and barriers and looking at graduate students and early career researchers. So, you know, when essentially the question asking when graduate students and early career researchers receive training and then they want to implement it, but they find obstacles in maybe a supervisor or PI, how do they bring folks on board? So sort of a readiness question when those are the barriers that are faced.
I go first again. Yeah, so we've encountered this as well. So a colleague of mine, Manoj Lalu, at the Ottawa Hospital, we used to run preclinical research design and reporting workshops, and we would teach them sort of rigorous methods around randomization, blinding, and so on in their preclinical work. And we'd bring them together, you know, for 2 full days. It'd be super empowering. These great relationships with these students, and then they all left, and you know, we felt like we'd made a difference. And then we quickly heard that as soon as they went back to their lab, their PI had basically indicated that, you know, they didn't have time for that. They should focus on writing. They should do these sort of other things that get counted. So one thing that we've tried to do with that particular work moving forward is engaging the PIs from inception. So now it's the PIs have to come to at least a half day of the 2-day workshop. And perhaps we you know, by default rule some people out, but it means those in the room, I think, are being more considered, and we're working with somewhat early adopters, even if they're not sort of super motivated. You know, they at least give us a few hours of their time to kind of understand the situation. And I think that sort of co-training is really important. I remember when I started at the Ottawa Hospital giving outreach and consulting, I remember being very nervous and anxious about providing method support to like very senior scientists and to clinicians, you know, real doctors. And, you know, we quickly realized that this problem around implementing open science, it's across the board, right? Like there's no one who is immune to needing outreach and education, because the space has developed so quickly. So I think making sure it's clear in your training that, you know, this is not specifically only an early career researcher problem or an issue for them to solve.
Thanks, Crystal and Mikhail. We have a few minutes, so anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I think also the approach is going to vary, like on an interpersonal level. I think the approach is also going to vary by PI. too. So some PIs may be actively hostile towards it, and I think that's a different approach than somebody that just is like, I don't know what this is. I don't have time for this. I think that's like a different approach. I know in talking with some folks that have successfully implemented pre-registration in their labs, one of the things that they did, was even just like starting to fill out a pre-registration themselves, right? And saying like, I was just trying to make sure that I was on the same page as everybody else. So I started to fill out this pre-registration with what I think is going on, and then using that as like a tool to like discuss amongst the lab to make sure that everybody's on the same page. And then when everybody's happy on it, then it's like, well, why don't we just go ahead and pre-register this, right? So like there's this kind of stealth kind of way of doing it, or this more collaborative way of doing it, instead of somebody coming in and saying, oh, we should change everything that we're doing, which I think is sometimes really scary to think about. But even just like starting to like, here's me trying to understand where we are, and is everybody on the same page? Are these the variables that we think we're going to do? Is that actually in this, and really having that conversation. Sometimes those kinds of approaches where you're coming to it saying like, I am also learning how to do this, and I'm interested in seeing how this applies to our lab. Instead of just coming in and saying like, we should just change everything that we're doing, we should just do this. And that's a little bit less threatening. So it's like, it depends on like exactly what the attitude of the PI is. Is it that they're curious, but they don't have time and they're not familiar with it? Or is it that they're actively hostile? Maybe there's some like myth busting that needs to happen depending on what the practice is. So it's like, I think that there are some interpersonal strategies too that can be really beneficial depending on your relationship with your PI.
Thanks, Crystal. Michaela, any last thoughts before we close out here on this topic?
No, I think I echo what has been said by Kelly and Crystal. We also have a group within NERC working on supervision, and yeah, it's really important to also target supervisors. It's really hard to target the ones who really don't want to be targeted. But yeah, I think that's also a problem that's gonna phase out in time as well. It's usually the very senior people who think it's not important. They became professor by doing it in their way. So I think, yeah, that problem is going to be solved in time. But for now, of course, some people suffer from it, and it's good to have an open eye for that.
Awesome. Okay, well, we're at time. So I just want to take a minute to thank our panel today for joining us in this conversation. I think it was really great, and for you all for attending and engaging. We will follow up from this with a recording and slides, and if we missed some Q&A, which we did, try to get to some of that and provide some responses. But again, just thank you so much for attending, and thank you to the panelists for this discussion. It was great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay.